today's webinar series is one of 3. All proceeds are donation-based for the webinar series, and we are putting funds towards a scholarship fund for community mental health graduate students at the California Institute of Integral Studies. For those of you who don't know, a lot of our students that go into the fields of community mental health come from underprivileged populations, as well as, many are first in their generation to attend college. So we will be providing annual scholarship to a student that demonstrates a high level of excellence, academic excellence, as well as demonstrating a financial need and other aspects that are going to support them in their education. So before further ado, let's get started. I wanted to share that today we will actually be reviewing a couple of things. And on the Q&A section, I will be stopping the recording so folks can chime in and ask questions. And you'll notice that if you do come to the other webinar series, there's going to be aspects of it that kind of flow right into the other parts. All right. So today we're really covering the areas of the introduction to intergenerational trauma, the impact of colonization and racialized trauma. I'm sure for some of you, this may be nothing new, might be something that you're already working on, something obviously I imagine that you feel really passionate about, and your choice to come in today and connect with us and be in community with us. First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge that we occupy the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on the traditional homeland. As uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as the first peoples and wish to pay our respects to ancestors, elders, and the relatives of the Ramaytush community. So today, what you'll be able to take away and have some understanding of is the intergenerational trauma, the historical context, and the impact of colonization and implications in today's society. Something else I want to mention about this is that really this is an introduction, right? There's so much more to develop, gain, and learn from this. If you are interested, please reach out to me. There are so many resources, trainings, and other ways that you can continue developing this area of work if it's something that you want to integrate, whether clinically, as therapists, or whatever field that you're in, that you want to develop in these skill sets. We can talk more about it, but this is really an introduction and getting a flavor and understanding of what and ways that this impacts us historically, presently, and probably and will be in their future. So I want to start with a poll just to see who's in the room, how it's showing up. These are terms you've heard of. Go ahead and chime in on the poll, and let's get a sense of that. All right, we'll take one more minute just to pop in your answers, and we'll just get a sense of who's in the room. One of the things that I've noticed over time is I've given this talk probably over the last maybe 5 or 6 years or so. And one of the things that I think is really exciting for me, as well as just great to see, is when I asked this question around intergenerational trauma. I remember like 15 years ago, nobody knew what this term was, right? Had no idea what I was talking about. And when I would share about this topic, folks would be like, yes, that makes sense. I get it. That I think this was a term that was relatively foreign to folks. And when I go into spaces now, a lot of times the room is full, right? Almost everyone is raising their hand. And that gives me a lot of joy to see that this topic is really spoken about on a regular basis. It's really a part of how we think about care and connection. So why don't we see what some of the results are for the polls? Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. So let's start with a little bit of a definition. So historical intergenerational trauma, defined by Dr. Karina Walters, is an event or series of events perpetuated against a group of people and their environment, namely people who share a specific group identity with genocidal or ethnocidal intent to systemically eradicate them as a people or eradicate their way of life. So relevant, has been relevant, ancestrally, historically relevant, and as well as showing up today. You know, it's interesting, right? This quote was in 2012. I'm sure if it was in 1950 versus even to the end 2024, I think it still holds a lot of relevance to who we are, how we're living, and what's happening globally. I want to share a little bit about, you know, what's happening, right? Some ways to think about the context of intergenerational trauma and how does it happen? So there's three types of trauma that are routinely passed on from person to person and really generation to generation. And some of the ways in which it shows up is either through family members, and that can show up individually or through family systems as abuse or mistreatment of another. It can also show up as abusive systems. And this is something that not a lot of people talk about in this context, but systems, not just within individual, right, family systems or familial systems, but larger institutional systems and institutional systems can actually be abusive. And I think in some ways, some of these get more normalized as well. So you'll see kind of parallel experiences between individual to individual, familial, as well as institutional or systems. So that's something to note and think about as we think about what kinds of trauma and ways in which it shows up, and generally simultaneously in which it occurs. Again, in another area, and you're going to learn more about this, a lot more about this in our next series workshop, is through our genes. So recent work in human genetics suggests that trauma is passed down through our DNA expression, which is also aka mRNA, and through the biochemistry, particularly in the human egg, sperm, and womb. And so Russell Minicum speaks to this aspect because more and more over the last, I would say, decade or so, it's become more and more relevant and clear that trauma can show up genetically. And so in the world of psychology, we used to think that schizophrenia was the only area that would show up organically in our brain. But what we're seeing with trauma is that it directly impacts our brain organically, where things like our hippocampus can shrink or grow. And there's a physical impact on what happens to our brain, which, you know, this in many ways is a new concept, but also makes perfect sense, right? And, you know, the brain is something that we know very little about. And the reality is we can't cut up in our brains while we're alive. To some degree we can, but not to the degree in which we can figure some of these pieces out. And so it is an ever growing field. And one of the things to consider is intergenerational trauma and resilience shows up a little bit different than maybe the way that we think of historically about trauma. And when we're really looking at trauma collectively as a field, it really wasn't something that we began to talk about until PTSD came into existence, which was really post-war, or they were seeing it in veterans, right? And so in a lot of ways, trauma as a field is relatively new and ever growing, and we're learning so much about it. And so I hope that as you continue to develop your sense and understanding of trauma, it will also help you best serve the populations and folks that you work with. I want to actually share this video clip because I think it's quite poignant and really gives a sense into what it's like in understanding ancestral and intergenerational trauma.
The story of our communities, people, and nation starts a long, long time ago. More than 60,000 years, in fact. This was when our culture and our law first started to thrive. We knew who we were and where we belonged. We took care of each other, our land, and our waters. We ate food that made us healthy, lived on country, and abided by our laws and song lines. Our families, our children were happy, with strong minds and hearts, because they were where they belonged. Then everything changed.
Colonization came, bringing wars, disease, famine, violence, and the destruction and violation of our cultural laws, sacred sites, families, and communities.
We were denied our knowledge, language, ceremonies, and identity, the very things that tell us who we are and where we belong, and our connections with each other and the land grew weak.
And then our children were taken from us. They had their names changed and their identities stripped away. They were told that Aboriginal people were bad. Worse still, they were told that their parents and grandparents did not want them.
For years this happened, and those children became known as the stolen generations.
Our children were denied love and experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. This left very deep, very complex, and very real wounds, leaving scars that are still being felt personally, socially, spiritually, and collectively.
In the time when our story started, we were able to parent in the cultural way that has seen our families survive and thrive for generations. Our people were strong, and our culture flowed and healed us in times of hurt.
But since the trauma of colonization and the stolen generations, we have not been able to heal in the same way. And we have unknowingly passed this trauma on to our children through sharing our sad stories and having them witness and experience our pain. This is known as intergenerational trauma, and we see symptoms today in broken relationships, disconnected families, violence, suicide, and drug and alcohol abuse.
But this is not where our story ends. We still have strong minds and hearts, and we still know who we were and where we belong. By creating safe and strong communities together, supporting our families to be free from pain, returning to our culture and building a strength of identity, we can stop the cycle of trauma and bring about positive intergenerational change so that we can continue to thrive for the next 60,000 years. There are simple things that we can all do to help heal our trauma.
Visit Healing Foundation.
So as we take a look at that, I think one of the things to consider is also resilience, right? More and more, we talk a lot about intergenerational trauma, but noting that intergenerational resilience is equally as important. And so what does that mean? What that means is when we look at the ways in which trauma has been passed down, we also simultaneously are looking at the ways that resilience have been passed on. And so as we move through today's presentation, I'd like you to think about that for yourself as well within your family lineage or ancestral lineage around the pieces that you've been able to take that support your well-being or the ways in which you notice your own development and supporting you in being able to move through challenges. And so being able to hold the legacy of both. And in some ways, we talk about this as like triggers and glimmers. If some of you have heard about this as well, we again talk a lot about triggers and orienting ourselves to look at glimmers as well. And we talk about this in CBT, right? Positive cognitions and negative cognitions. And we as a human culture and being, and animals do this as well, but a disposition towards negative. And when we look at genetically, that exists to protect us, right? It's actually neurobiologically ingrained into our being, our cells, our existence, our thinking as a way to protect us. And so thank you so much, right, for protecting us. And in our current time and age, when we're not running away from saber-toothed tigers and other predators and the level of hypervigilance that we needed in order to not be prey, in some ways it's harming us, right? To not be able to look at all aspects of the ways in which we are whole. And so thinking about us as whole beings. So thinking about some historical context, these are some aspects I'd like you to pay particular attention to. And some of these things are country and land of origin, reasons for forced or chosen immigration or migration. And I'm really specific around identifying this, right? Because migration and immigration is not the same across the board for folks. There's many things to consider, such as reasons for it, Is it something related to asylum or refugee, or is it a chosen immigration? And there's a privilege that comes with chosen immigration, right? There's financial aspects that go into that. Also, another piece to take into consideration is distance of migration, right? Land migration or immigration versus overseas migration and immigration. And all pieces just to consider and think about. In addition, who and what is the country of origin, right? We come from so much diversity in our culture, and thinking about country, language, culture, and then within that, all the nuances that come with that. So historical context, when we think about the way that we connect and work with others, whether as a therapist or other fields of service, or just being in community with other people, how do we hold and think about this narrative story? Considering the impact of historical, experiential, multi-generational trauma, right? So this really is talking about the story that's passed down. And we all come from some historical, experiential, multi-generational experience. And so this may be something we know. And other times, for some folks, it's been cut off from them, right? It's been eradicated from them. It's been taken from them. So there are different, that's another nuance, right? That's another piece around, there are folks that can tell you, like, I actually don't know where my grandparents or great grandparents come from. I know that through my ancestry, after doing, say, a DNA ancestry, you might learn some information about yourself, but sometimes that doesn't give us the answers we need or that we're hoping for. And so in this process, it's really engaging with inquiry and connecting with what we do know, but also connecting with what we don't. So for example, I have a client that I've worked with before, and she knows that her family has been here for many, many generations, actually more like 450 years or so. But she doesn't know much about her African ancestry, right? As we know, in slavery, it's been stripped from African Americans. And so one of the things in her own journey and in her own historical narrative is reconnecting with what it means to be Black for her. And that's her narrative, her story, the ways in which she begins to feel connected to herself, her people, her community, her lineage, her genetics, right? And that's so complex. And being able to sit with whatever that means for the person. We, even as therapists, are absolutely not the experts of any of that, right? Coming from a place of curiosity, we may need to learn some of these pieces and being able to more deeply understand folks that come into our room with us, right? But you are absolutely not an expert of anyone else's life, even if we know a thing or two about psychology. And so I encourage the ways in which we sit with the nuanced spaces of folks' narratives, because that is what helps them connect with their story. Another piece to consider is white supremacy through colonization and oppression throughout history. This is pervasive, right, around every country. And if we're talking about the US, obviously, we have a very specific white supremacist colonization story and experience. And depending on whether you're Black, Indigenous, Latino, and other ethnic group, it varies, right? But we look at white supremacy and colonization throughout history, globally around the world, you can see the thread in which that has shown up everywhere. And so these are aspects to consider. And when I talk about historical context, there are some therapists and folks who do this work where this is the work they do, right? This is the primary lens in which they are providing healing work, because that's what a client may be seeking out to connect with, right? But clients come in to see you for many, many different reasons, right? And so when I say holding the historical context, this is maybe something that you hold in your mind. This may be something that you directly ask about, but it may not be, right? And I think in some ways, when we're working with BIPOC folks, we have a responsibility to know that there's this narrative and this aspect of showing up in their lives, whether they're aware of it or not. And so whether it becomes part of treatment or not is contingent on what they're coming in for, right? What your client is coming in for. What are folks coming in to talk to you about? What is their healing process and where are they with it? In this country, looking at political, racial, experiential, systemic, intergenerational aspects that are passed down, right? We cannot ignore the socio-political aspect of what is happening in this country's trauma, currently, historically, or otherwise, right? So I think people often ask me, like, therapy doesn't seem like a place to talk about politics. Sure, we're not talking about the election, right? But if you're thinking about the environmental, psychological, socio-political aspect, absolutely, because that is part of our identity, right? Whether that's who do you feel an alliance to in regards to like your country of origin, or what do you feel proud of, if that means, or not proud of in being an American, right? Like these are pieces that show up, and they may show up significantly or maybe minutely, but they are part of the existence of us as we environmentally connect with one another. So this is something just to consider, again, a historical context and lens to consider. Some of the things we see, this is just an example. It's not the only result, but an example of how systemic oppression is interconnected with interracial tension and conflict, right? It exists simultaneously. And actually, there are many aspects that show as a result of. So systemic oppression creates and is part of what fuels interracial tension and conflict, for example. I really like some of the work that Dr. Rupa Mayar is doing. She is a doctor, a physician that works at UCSF in San Francisco, and very much thinking, and we often don't think about physicians or MDs as folks that are doing this work. And I think there are many individuals in the field of medicine as well that are doing this work. And so she talks, and she actually she created this, right? And it really came from the place of looking at how is colonization, white supremacy or supremacism, capitalism, and exploitation of the human experience causing directly disease or dis-ease and inflammation. And inflammation, she specifically is referring to how it's causing and developing illness. And so when you look at folks who have experienced not just intergenerational trauma, but say complex trauma, and it maybe started with them in this period of time, and most people who are and have experienced complex trauma, if you look back into their history, have experienced some intergenerational or transgenerational trauma. But what she's found is that inflammation has caused a lot of health concerns, right? We look at mortality rates between locations such as, and I live in the Oakland, San Francisco Bay Area, so I will speak to kind of the demographics here, but in the Oakland Hills versus the Flatlands, you'll see about a 10 to 15 year difference in mortality rate, simply by location, right? Due to a number of things like food deserts, resources, access to care, a number of things that play into that and more. So these aspects then obviously show up in health. We're looking at high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, other things that are more benign show up like migraines, indigestion, IBS, right? And so chronic back pain, chronic pains in certain areas, we know that it is psychosomatically related when we've experienced trauma. Sometimes we can't always tell though, right? Like something that we're chronically in a stressful dynamic or situation, we don't always see that maybe our upper back pain is associated with that. And so those are just some things to begin to create some links around, and it may not be, right? It could be an injury and not related to that at all. But psychosomatic symptoms and trauma they go hand in hand. And so when we're treating trauma, we're treating the whole body, right? We're treating the body. And nowadays, I would say mental health is simply health. And I think the more that we're able to connect and integrate those aspects of ourselves, the better work that we're going to do in taking care of ourselves, as well as being able to take care of others. So Dr. Mayar talks about the understanding of the root causes of pathologies that we see today that impact all of us, but affect Brown, Black, and poor people most intensely. And we examined the foundations of this around colonization, right? Colonization was a way to extractive economic systems of capitalism that came into this land, right? This is part of what has occurred in this land, on this land. And so not only that, but it's supported by the systems of supremacy and domination, which are a necessary part of keeping wealth and power accumulated in the hands of colonizers and ultimately their financiers. So this is another example, right, of we can't separate the socio-political aspects of what's happening in this country with our health and well-being. And so being able to look at it from micro and macro perspective is a holistic approach in looking at what's occurring for people, particular Brown, Black, and Indigenous folks. Some work I want to note is the work of Dr. Joy DeGruy-Leary. If you haven't heard of her work, she was really I would say one of the pioneers in thinking about and talking about intergenerational, multi-generational trauma. Her book on post-traumatic slave syndrome really dives into specifically centuries of slavery and institutionalization and oppression in the way that it shows up in the Black community. But as we read her texts, her theories, her lectures, we can see how it can overlay on many, many different populations. And so at this point, I think she's more than 12 years of quantitative and qualitative research. I think she's probably in the 15, 18 years now. She talks about a condition that exists when a population has experienced multi-generational trauma, in this case, resulting from centuries of slavery, and continue to experience oppression and institutionalized racism today. There's this example that she shared in a lecture that I sat in on that she shared about. And one of the things that she shared was related to the story about parenting. And she said, she was talking about the story about a parent that would hit their children, Black parent, two of their kids, would hit their children, and they would go above and beyond even. She described it in this way. And she talked about it as a protective factor, that these Black parents wanted to ensure that they disciplined their kids so much harder because coming from a hand of love versus having to go into the world and possibly be killed, right? This comes from this, and this has happened for generations, from being lynched, right? If they're out of line, it can be life or death. And you see how that shows up even with parenting now. And so she shares about this example. Another example she gives is, she shares a story about, oh, when I go and stay at a hotel and I leave the room cleaner than when I came into it. And I don't think this is just specific necessarily to the Black experience. I can say that that's true about some other ethnicities as well. But the question here is, why? Why would we do that? Why would that even come into your mind as something that isn't really important? Like, I vigilantly leave the room cleaner than if I left it. Some of you probably already know the answer to this, and for others, I'll share a little bit about why. The reason is because if somebody sees somebody who walks out of that room or stayed in that room, who's Black, Brown, Indigenous, there's an assumption that they're not clean, or that they made a mess, or that they probably destroyed something. These are biases that are ingrained, oftentimes subconscious, sometimes conscious, into the way that we may view or think about Black, Brown, or Indigenous folks. And so this is why this shows up in this way. So I'm giving you an example of like behaviorally, everyday life, things that you may not even think about. And for those who have some privilege in that area, that's not something that might even cross your mind. So, oh, there's a question. Let me take a look at your question. Board certified health and wellness coach. Oh, nice to meet you. Thank you. This experience that mental health is physical health. Do you have a text citation for where this diagram comes from? Yes, I do. I can provide that in the Q&A section, if that's okay, or I might need to send it since I'm mid-presentation, but yes, I do. Pat asked, when I was a child, my dad told me that we needed to leave the motel room clean because he wanted to be willing to accept reservations for Black people that came after us. Another great example. Thank you. Absolutely. Right. And I think something else you're speaking to, Pat, is actually thinking about community and collectivism. We also, I don't talk a lot about this in my presentation, but there's this aspect about individualistic versus collectivistic kind of societies or experiences, right? And this is so important. This is particularly important in the healing, collective healing aspect, and our our path to liberation, ultimately. And so I actually am writing a peer review right now around decolonizing psychotherapy and really looking at the healing aspect of collectivist communities and the way that we can reintegrate that. Because what's colonization, white supremacy has done is forced individualization, right? And force us to function alone and have this belief system that we need to make it on our own, which then segregates us from one another. So something I want to note, examples of whom have been impacted by intergenerational trauma. This is not a fully inclusive list. These are examples. And so you can see kind of just a glimpse into the ways that it's shown up in many, many, many communities, cultures, and people over time. And again, I won't be reading this slide. You can take a look at it. And you'll also notice that it's kind of again, talking about macro and micro, but we're talking about communities and neighborhoods and communities dealing with community violence versus like a whole population of folks, right? All relative to what we're talking about today. It actually doesn't matter whether it's within your family experience or not, that it matters and it doesn't matter. Meaning, whether it's macro on an institutional systemic level of a whole country or a whole people or a whole region, right? Versus a community or neighborhood, we see similar experiences, symptoms that show up in those different ways. And that's what I mean by relevant, not relevant. So something I'd like to dive into in this moment, I might go back to one of the other slides. In this part, actually, I would like your participation. And folks in the room can actually speak. So one of the ways that you can connect with is being able to raise your hand, and then we can actually call on you so that you're able to speak. But before we dive into that, an anonymous attendee wanted to share a comment. Their comment was something relevant to this slide, the one previously. Holocaust survivor and trauma expert Dr. Gabor Mate has commented that PTSD symptoms are an epidemic among Palestinians under Zionist occupation. He comments that post-traumatic stress is not even an adequate description of the trauma that's ongoing, and never post. Yes, thank you for your comment. For those of you who don't know Dr. Gabor Mate's work, I highly recommend it. He's definitely been very active in our conversations around what's happening in Palestine and genocide as well. So there's actually a concept by Dr. Lillian Comas-Diaz around post-colonization stress. And again, not necessarily appropriate or even speaks to that, but one of the things that she speaks to is that it's post-traumatic stress disorder plus. So all the things that come with cultural impacts, oppression, genocide, right? These are the things that we're really integrating and talking about in this aspect. And so this particular concept and theory that she speaks to, and she really started talking about it in 2000, but has really had a lot of publications related to this topic, is speaking actually to this piece that you're talking about. Thank you. So this question for discussion: when considering your own historical, cultural, racial, familial background, what intergenerational components have been passed down that you can identify with? And if folks would like to raise their hand, we can call on you, we can unmute you. I'd love to hear from folks in the room. Sarah also shared in the comments of Dr. Samad Jabbar, am I saying that name right? Chair of the Palestinian Ministry of Health's Mental Health Unit, speaks on chronic trauma stress disorder, RA Palestine. Thank you. Hi, Nikki.
Hi. Oh, let me do this. Okay. As a Black woman who has roots in the South, and then my family moved north during the Great Migration. One of the things that got passed down to us was a tradition of silence, of not talking about some of the negative experiences. So my family moved away from the South and didn't talk about the South ever, right? And then that translated into even like with interpersonal traumas, not speaking on it.
I love this example, Nikki. Thank you. And I know that this resonates with a lot of people and a lot of folks in this room, but what silence does to us, right? And we think about the mechanism of silence. Silence is a way to kind of a way to be safe. But what happens is that silence is part of actually what has caused illness. And I talk about this actually in next week's or in 2 weeks. I talk about the impact of silence, right? Or the impact and how that shows up as functional freeze, people pleasing, depression, or unexpressed anger, right? I can only imagine the amount of rage, anger that we are carrying, that Black folks are carrying in their body on a regular basis. Of course. And yet that gets demonized as like you're bad or you get labeled in these ways, right? But it's like your anger and rage is solely warranted. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Gabby, yeah, no problem. Gabby?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Piggybacking off of that comment of silence as an immigrant and formerly undocumented person, yeah, being seen and not heard, but also not questioning authority.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of, stay quiet, follow the rules, don't get attention put on yourself, is something that I'm consistently trying to unlearn, but it's pervasive. It's super deep. It's there, and I see it in all day, every day. But naming that is really important.
Gabby, I was
Yeah.
wondering as we're talking about today's presentation, right? Like there's this aspect of that personal experience that you're consistently feeling yourself challenged around. Like, I'm really working on speaking up. I'm really working on being able to not silence myself when internally, I mean, you talk about somatically, you can almost feel it in your throat, right? A lot of my clients and folks talk about like, when I want to speak, I feel tightness in my throat. And how do you think that's tied to white supremacy, capitalism, and these other pieces that we're talking about and where we individually are experiencing it?
I think you mentioned it earlier of like getting out of line. And if you question authority, then that means you're getting out of line, and that means you're a threat to the status quo. And so that comes with some harsh punishments, and that kind of system was played out within my family as well, with, the head of the household, what they say go, you don't question that. And that was played out in our country with the Civil War and everything. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to take one more for the first question, and then we're going to move on to the second question. Also, just for folks to be aware, I will be re-asking this question at the beginning of the next series, because I think it's such an important way to connect the pieces. And so you will be here at the next series. You'll also have an opportunity to ask this question. Heather.
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Black and Filipina. So definitely on the Black side of my family, the discipline with violence
Mm-hmm.
is definitely, that was something that was passed down, but luckily that is not continuing on. And then on my maternal side, my mom is from the Philippines and was born during World War II there, but definitely what has been passed down, and unfortunately, I see continuing into the younger generations through other people in my family, would be like codependency and enmeshment,
Mm-hmm.
and an ability to set energetic boundaries, when it comes to relating.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. That's a great example, right? Like being able to tie what's been conditioned within us and how it shows up in like all of our interpersonal relationships, right? And I think it's really great that you're able to like notice and identify how it's showing up, right? That's our access to our healing. Thank you for sharing your story.
Thanks.
Experience. I wanted to check in with folks about question number 2. I think some of you may have shared this, but how has it shaped you? And are there components of this multi-generational pattern that you're actively working on to heal? And I think some of you began to share about it, but if there's anyone else who would like to chime in on this bit, would love to hear. In the meanwhile, I want to share kind of what's been in the comments as well as questions. We will also have a Q&A section, and that portion won't be recorded, but I really want to be able to get to some questions in the room because I'm sure there are some questions here. Anonymous attendee mentioned, probably not popular in this community, but calling the Palestine experience currently genocide pings in my body and activates it. It seems insensitive for communities who actually have experienced targeted genocide because of aspects of their identity to be compared to the community that's experiencing a great trauma, yes, but not targeted because of identity. It's like calling the war in Ukraine genocide, but none do. I appreciate the comment, and you're welcome to be able to share where you stand and where you sit in your experience. For me, a Black person living on the African continent, my own internalized oppression and seeing white people as superior through stories of my parents living under British colonial Kenya, and currently seeing the place of my country in global political dynamics of aid and migration issues. Thank you so much for sharing this, right? And in real time, what it's like on the African continent and the ways that colonial rule, British colonial rule specifically, shows up even today, and will continue to, even if you're an independent state and have independence or liberation or freedom. But I think that's something to note, right? Liberation and freedom doesn't happen the moment you are a free state, right? There is a ripple effect of how colonization and imperialism and white supremacy and capitalism has shown up, right? It gets interwoven into the roots of the country, the land, and the people. And so even with liberation or freedom of the state, there are ripple effects to that. I'm going to provide some space for folks to answer question 2. Cecilia? And then Lois.
So in thinking about this question, how it's shaped me, I think a lot of it is internalized. I think the vast majority of it, and things that especially around colonization, that we don't realize, it's the internalized ideologies, the modes of thinking. And one of the ways that I try to combat this, especially as an Indigenous person, and as a mother, it's the rejection of the culture that has been internalized for me. Our ethnocide has been something well documented, and the assimilation process that we've had to go through generationally. And so having that forced upon us to reject our culture. So instead of aligning ourselves with that rejection, focusing on culture and traditional knowledge as active components of my life is one way that I do that to combat the colonization and use it as a source of healing that decenters Eurocentric ideologies and Western knowledge.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for that. And you're doing every day, right? You're doing the work every day. And I want to note this, right? The level of emotional, mental, physical labor that it takes and the exhaustion that is part of this process. And yet it's so essential, right? It needs to be done. And I think this is a piece that's really important. I think about this a lot with my students, but is the labor that they're carrying with them all the time, and how that healing process is exhausting and essential, right? And I think it's so important to acknowledge that piece as well. Thank you, Cecilia. Lois, and then we're gonna move to Q&A.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, it's, looking at, you talk about the multi-generational pattern. I looked at my great-grandmother and her relationship with my grandmother. Then it moved into the relationship with my mother. And now and these are all broken relationships with an incredible amount of pain. And you go back and you look at the fact that the devaluing of African American women, and how that internalizes to ourselves. And so looking how to heal that has been really difficult, because much of what we do is we disconnect from who we are because of the pain of not only that historical legacy of enslavement, of abuse, and also, you know, as Zora Neale Hurston says, we are the mules of the earth, that it is, you know, and I see these patterns continuously completing, and even with my sister. And, you know, it has been a continuous process for me right now. I'm really just trying to reconnect with, one, my inquiry in CIIS is about sheroes. So part of it is creating a template where we can connect with women who have found ways to heal, to pull, you know, and connect with characteristics and resilience and ways to transverse these untenable situations and the pain and do something to give back to outside and to ourselves. So this is a deeply, you know, just a deeply painful and also great opportunity for me, hopefully, to change my space as well as give back to others. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for sure, Lois. You know, Lois touched on something I think that's important to note, which is it can feel so massive, right? Like, oh my gosh, like how many years of healing will I have to do? And I think one of the things to hone in on is like, what's right in front of you is the work. Every time you maybe shift the way you discipline your child, you might even feel it. Like when you feel angry and you feel that rage and you're like, and you really want to yell at your kid. And that's real, right? Like that's a very real thing. But to be like, hold on, let me take a breath. Let me pause and consider if maybe I could do this a little different. That micro moment is not micro. Those moments matter. Every time you do that, you're potentially shifting a pattern. You're changing the possibility of being able to have something different, and that matters. And I want to say that, right, to be able to hone in on those pieces that are happening in real time. Ma'am, did you want to say something?
I'm muted. No. Yeah, just jumping on that as well. The opposite has been my experience, which is I'm so hyper vigilant of like the things I carry and not wanting to do for the next generation the same thing that I'm starting to realize. And folks have been telling me that like actually you can show up more. You can show up more as yourself, as a person, as your experiences, rather than just being that kind of objective, like really neutral, you know, person who's supportive, but you can show up your feelings, you can show up your history. And it's kind of been a kind of parabola swing of I guess it would be the resilience part where it's like, it's not that you're carrying all the bad things or all the things you don't want to push forward. You could also start owning and giving to your kids that are helpful. But that's been a large swing.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Like, and just what it means to be human, right? You're human first before you're a mom, before you are your lineage, before you're a child of your parents, right? And how do you lean into being human? And that's such beautiful modeling, right, for your kids. The other thing you're touching on is the swinging on the pendulum. With trauma, you will see it. It often shows up in this way, right? We're either replaying a dynamic or a way in which we were raised or disciplining our kids or kind of not being able to help ourselves in the way that partners that we pick, you know, all these things that show up that are mirroring in repetition compulsion, right? That's repetition compulsion, where it's like we're replaying something out over and over again with the attempt to heal. But if we're not healing through the process, then we're just repeating the trauma. The other is the swing on the pendulum, which is I will absolutely not do the things that my parents did. I will absolutely, to the best of my ability, reject those aspects of what was harmful, right? Neither of those are really healing, right? They are just avoidance. They're avoidance of pain or avoidance of, and attempting to work on some of that, right? Because ultimately the healing is integration. So how do we bring those pieces together and be able to find the integrative part? So you'll see, and you'll see this in your emotional states as well. Again, next, we'll talk a lot about mental emotional states in 2 weeks, but we're looking at numbing versus flooding. This is something I talk to my students a lot about, and as well in my classes, but like the desensitization to not feel, right? And that can show up in addiction, that can show up in workaholism as well, perfectionism, but this way in which we do not feel, and we got to keep it together, and we're going to always show that we have this like put together perception to others, or the part in which we're so emotionally volatile and it's really hard to contain, and we feel super, super, super overwhelmed, and it comes out in ways that we often don't feel we have control over. And so there's this high level of control attempting on one end, and then this way in which we feel like it's chaos and falling apart. So these are kind of the polarization in which trauma can show up within us as well.